Good morning. Welcome to the December Greenwood County Democratic Party virtual breakfast meeting. I am so happy that you took the time to join us on this Saturday morning. It's been just over 1 month since the big election in November, and in incredible ways, the presidential election is still not determined, although you and I both know it is. There is a substantial and loud portion out there that argues otherwise. But we're not going to dwell on that at the moment. We have a packed agenda for you today. We're going to start off with a detailed review of the election numbers, both at the national, state, and local level, and then talk a little bit about the lessons learned. Done a lot of reading, done a lot of chatting with other voters and leaders in the community. I want to share with you some of the lessons learned and how we might be able to position ourselves for success in 2022 and beyond. We also have an election that's still ahead of us here in Greenwood for City Council Ward 2, and we're going to hear from both candidates, Patricia Partlow and Marcial Renea Rapp-Little. They're speaking with us today, so we're excited to have them on board. We've also got a very interesting Q&A with radio personality, Brother Bill Robinson. Then we're going to go over some updates within our party, what's going on, what's our events that we have planned for the future. And then we'll open the forum up for any Q&A or discussions with all of you fine folk in the meeting with us today. So without further ado, let's talk about the 2020 election. So the first thing that I thought was very interesting was the turnout. You know, we're always holding voter registration drives, we're rocking the vote, we're trying to get people out to the polls, whether by car or other means. So how did we do on various levels? Well, it's always good to have a baseline. So let's start with the 2016 presidential election. At the national level, there were almost 231 million voters out there allowed to be able to vote, and 136.7 million of them actually voted with a turnout of 59.2%. Compare that with what happened in November in this last presidential election. Those numbers skyrocketed. Almost 8 million more voters became eligible nationwide, but more importantly, it looks like 22 million more voters participated. I mean, that's more than just new voters. That's a lot of voters that came off the sidelines and got into the voting booth and cast a vote. So the turnout of 66.2% is huge change for just 4 years' time. At the state level, we had a turnout of 67, almost 68%, 3.31 million capable voters, but only 2.12 actually turned out. How did it go in the midterms? Well, midterms are not as exciting as the presidential election, so we only had a 55% turnout. And also notice the number of registered voters was practically the same. So from that same pool of voters, a lot fewer turned out to vote in the midterms. And apparently a governor's election is nowhere near as exciting as a presidential election. So what happened here in South Carolina for the presidential election? Our turnout rate beat the national average. It was 71.1%. So a couple of things I want you to note. In 2 years, from 2018 to 2020, there was a lot more new voters. We registered, and not we, the Greenwood Democrats, but as a state, 40,000, 45,000 more voters participated. And again, a lot more came off the sidelines to vote. So we had increased turnout compared to the national average. Here in Greenwood County, how did we fare in those 3 elections? Well, in the presidential election, we had a turnout of 70%. Interestingly, in the midterms, it looks like we actually lost population and went from 41.7 to 40.5 thousand registered voters. So we lost voters as a total, and as per the state, the participation rate dropped down to 56. But then we hit the 2020 presidential election. We blew past the state and national averages. 3 out of 4 eligible voters in Greenwood County voted this year. And that's just absolutely mind blowing. Over 3,000 or just about 3,000 new voters were added to the ranks. And then the turnout, 9,000 new voters turned out to vote in Greenwood County. So the get out the vote efforts on both sides of the aisle certainly was very effective this year. So let's look at some of the results then. For president, this is where things stand as of yesterday, with Biden getting the Electoral College victory and a very commanding 81.2 million to 74.2 million nationwide. And you can see the map there with the colors red and blue. What I thought was interesting was looking at the 2016 presidential election, where Donald Trump won that with the same but flipped electoral vote count. And what you can see are the states that flipped. And I think most of us can probably name those states off the top of our head, but just for fun, it's Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. They all flipped from an electoral college perspective, and that led to the victory for Biden. Now, as we look at some raw numbers, I want to look at the U.S. Senate, what happened between Lindsey Graham and Jamie Harrison. And by the way, the polls were wrong. And these guys are experts that get paid to do that for a living. Tons of money goes into polling firms, and they were way off. I was in an all-chairs meeting with the state Democratic Party recently, and Trav Robertson, the state party chair, he was scratching his head, saying that the best of the best experts, nobody really knew what was going on. The percentages were way off, not only in 2016, and we all thought they would have it fixed or figured out by the time 2020 rolled around. That was not the case. So looking at some raw numbers then between Trump and Biden, nationally it was a 46.9 to 51.3% popular vote split. In South Carolina, Trump was much more popular, 55.1 to 43.4. Now, it's not an insignificant or too significant difference, I should say. I mean, 1.38 million to 1.09 million. That's not what I would call a hard red state. It certainly is a hard to win state because there's a lot of votes you have to catch up on, but really, it's not a universal mandate where South Carolina completely and absolutely backed Donald Trump. And then here in Greenwood County, the Trump flavor was even stronger, where Donald Trump took almost 61% of the vote in our little region. So how did that translate to the U.S. Senate? I think everybody knew that Trump was going to win in South Carolina, but the prevailing theory was that even Republicans were not happy with Lindsey Graham and would flip to Jamie Harrison. But I think in hindsight, you got to think that if somebody was a diehard Trump supporter, then there's no way they're voting any other way up and down the ballot. And in the U.S. Senate, that really did reflect that sentiment. So as you see, while Trump got 1.38 million and 55% of the vote, Lindsey got 1.37 million and 54.4% of the vote in South Carolina. Now, yes, some people did flip, but man, it was nowhere near enough to make up that difference. So yes, Jamie Harrison did a little bit better than Joe Biden did statewide, but it's a statistical glitch. I mean, it really didn't make a difference, and it was never close. That's a 10% difference between the two. And then in Greenwood County, it's the same story. It was the same, but worse. Lindsey Graham took even more than he did statewide. He had 59% popularity in Greenwood versus Jamie Harrison's 39%. So truly, the Trump effect in Greenwood County is extraordinarily strong. At the congressional level, looking at the 3rd Congressional District, and SC3 is made up of all or portions of 11 counties in the northwestern portion of South Carolina. Jeff Duncan, as he has every other year for the past, however many times he ran away with it. He took 71% of the vote in all of SC3. And interestingly, here in Greenwood, he did not fare as well as he did in the entire congressional district. He only got 64%. Still, 64 compared to 35, that's a lot of votes that one would have to make up in order to win in Greenwood County. It's also interesting to note as I'm comparing the Trump numbers versus the congressional numbers. In Greenwood County, Trump gets 60.7% of the vote and Duncan got 64. That means that there are some people that crossed the aisle that voted for Biden and then went ahead and voted for Jeff Duncan. And to be honest with you, I would like to interview those people. I need to understand that mentality. That made absolutely no sense. Okay, in the state Senate, and I'm not going to hit every local election, just a couple of the highlights here, but in state Senate District 10, we are all absolutely devastated to lose the wonderful representation that we had in Floyd Nicholson. But as you can see, the Trump bump just really knocked him out. There was a lot to overcome once you incorporate the Trump effect. And let's just take a look at the two different levels. District 10 has parts of Abbeville, McCormick, Saluda, and Greenwood in it. So there's 4 different counties all playing a role. And I think only McCormick was the one that stayed blue for Floyd, and the other 3, Abbeville, Greenwood, and Saluda, went for Billy Garrett. And as you can see across District 10, Billy got 56% to Floyd's 44. And here in Greenwood, he fared better, as we would expect, but with a 53 to 46% differential. But where the Trump effect came into play, you can see that Floyd's popularity in this district, his reputation, his history, his accomplishments, actually drew off a lot of Trump voters to vote for Floyd. If Trump's enjoying a 60% popularity, yet here in Greenwood, Billy Garrett only enjoyed 53%, that means there was quite considerable crossover. So I thought that was extraordinarily interesting. And again, it's not a strong mandate there for Billy Garrett. So we're definitely going to have to watch what he does over the next 4 years and then ramp up and field a very strong candidate to take that seat back. And then in House District 13, this was Denise Waldrop versus John McCravey, and this was a what I'll call a gerrymandered district. This takes all of Greenwood County, except a portion that goes over to that borders along Lawrence County, as well as Uptown. So Ann Parks's district is a lot of the city area. Denise gets everything else. It looks like a big Pac-Man when you look at it on a map. And when you've carved out the heavily Democratic area of Greenwood County, what you have is a breakdown of 71.6% to 28.3%. And just for the record, it's pretty much been that exact same split year after year. Now, I will say that Denise fielded a wonderful campaign. Given the COVID situation, she really couldn't go knocking on doors as all candidates, pretty much were not able to do so. But more postcards, television ads, newspaper ads, the works. She was doing some very creative things online as well as in print. And it didn't make a difference. In fact, I think here's another example where the Trump bump actually helped maintain that strong of a lead. I really think that if it weren't for Trump and if this were a midterm election, Denise's percentage would have been considerably higher, but the Trump bump was able to keep that at bay. So that's just a quick review of the numbers. What are some of the takeaways then? Some of the bigger picture patterns and trends that we've noticed or that I've heard from in various meetings? Well, first of all, straight ticket voting. was just terrible. This means that a voter does not care for the individual um, candidate. They just pull the button once, pre-populates all of the candidates, and away you go. And this cycle, Republicans did that 59% of the time, and Democrats did it 41% of the time. And I think it's just as bad for Democrats as it is for Republicans. I'm truly of the belief that a voter should be required to pick out individual names. And if they truly are up and down Republican voters, great, but they have to go through the effort of seeing the name and picking it. And in fact, 4 years ago, both the GOP and Democratic chairman, and back then Jamie Harrison was the chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party, they both called on legislators to eliminate that option. But that's the only way that it's going to be taken off, is if it's done through a law. And I think the Republicans enjoyed it so much, and they also have the majorities. I don't see that changing anytime soon. Another thing that was interesting was that the absentee voting experiment was a success in both the primary and general election, getting rid of the need to have a valid reason and expanding it so that everybody in South Carolina could participate. Well, just about half of all votes were cast before Election Day in South Carolina, whether it was in-person absentee voting or through the mail absentee voting. But you can only imagine that with the turnout that we saw, how crowded those polling locations would have been and how long lines could have been if this wasn't allowed to have been spread out across the weeks. Not to mention the absolute health damage this would have caused with the COVID-19 forcing everybody into the polling locations on Election Day. But it worked. It worked well. There were really no complaints statewide of a serious nature that there was anything bad about this process. And to be honest, there should be no reason why this couldn't be made a permanent way of voting in South Carolina going forward. And also, it really truly did not seem to benefit only the Democrats. When the polling was done, it looked to be the same percentages took advantage of early voting as did in-person voting. One thing that was noticed, and Trav Robertson, the state party chair, pointed out to us, he said that the Democrats have been growing with more consistent voters. That means our voters who vote in presidential and midterms seem to be a lot more consistent, while the Republicans see larger swings between presidential and midterm elections. So if you are a candidate running in a midterm, it truly does seem like your chances are better because the Democrats come out in a stronger force during those midterms. Something to think about as we head into 2022 for anybody out there who's thinking of potentially running for office. Across the nation, it was also noted by some that the more progressive the candidate, the more successful they were. And this, has come out as a result of a little bit of finger pointing within the Democratic Party at the national level. But those who went, full progressive, went towards the Bernie Sanders side and the AOC side, they're the ones that seem to make it through and make it past any challenges that they faced. Now, at the same time, it could be because they are in more progressive districts and could get away with it, but it's just an observation that we may take under consideration. It was also noted nationwide that white men swung in large numbers to Biden, while Trump made gains with Black and Latino voters. So we have some long conversations that need to be had to understand and get behind those facts. And then another fact that just boggles my mind, counties with the worst virus surges overwhelmingly voted for Trump. So I'll just let that stay there. Not much more commentary we can provide. At the local level, South Carolina was hit very hard, and it was also noted that South Carolina wasn't the only one. You take a state like New Hampshire, and although New Hampshire swung for Joe Biden, they lost both the House and their Senate to Republican majorities. So they had a swing in the opposite direction at the local level, while at the state level, Biden ended up winning the electoral count. So here in South Carolina, Republicans gained in both the House and the Senate. And the straight ticket voting and aligning with the perceived party values seemed to override whatever qualifications, experience, talent, actual accomplishments. You take a candidate like Mandy Powers Norrell and you watch her debate her candidate who couldn't answer a single question in that debate. There is no doubt in any sane person's mind that her candidate, whatever her name was not qualified to be there. At the end of the day, that didn't matter. Straight ticket voting and being a Republican meant more. So they could just throw a warm body up there, and no matter how good the Democratic candidate was, didn't have a chance. And I think we had a lot of that here in Greenwood as well. We had a couple weeks back, we had a Zoom social hour, and we had about a little over a dozen people join, and we just vented and aired our grievances and talked about the election and what our opinions were. Here are some notes that I took from that session. For straight ticket voting, we need to educate against it. So we need to get out that message and early. We want the voters to really understand and know the candidates. We need to challenge Republican misinformation. We can't let it just sit out there. We need to be loud and vociferous when misinformation comes out. Republicans tend to run on national issues instead of local issues. So when you hear the local Republican candidate speak, he tended to talk about big social issues, while the Democratic candidates tend to talk about the local issues, talk about Greenwood, talk about South Carolina. And then the Republicans would also try to tie the local candidates to the national candidates. For example, a Republican ad would never mention the name Jamie Harrison without also mentioning Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. For whatever that's worth, they tried to tie the local candidate to the national picture. We also believe that the swing or persuadable voters were a little bit more rare than we had anticipated. The people who were locked in Republican were locked in. We also saw that the local Republicans utilize PAC money extensively, outspending the Democratic candidates by a large amount. And then the social issues of religion, abortion, Black Lives Matters, other social programs, those were hot buttons that were pressed constantly, even though here at the local level, it had much less impact or importance here in Greenwood. It goes back to tying it into national hot button issues. So they were used frequently. So what can we do as we head into the future? And these are opinions, and I certainly encourage disagreement or refinement of these opinions. But number one, never give up. Always continue fighting. As I wrote to everybody in an email after the election, change is never about every year or an election cycle or every other year. Change is about long-term battles. We're fighting over decades here, everybody. So we need to constantly fight, never get up. And in fact, I'm feeling a lot more reinvigorated than ever before. And I'm looking for the challenge of continuing to push that needle each and every election. We need to help our candidates develop an aggressive game plan early. And I feel like with what we've learned as a party this last election cycle, the notes we've taken, the relationships we've built, the skills we've developed, we're going to be able to come out swinging day one when a candidate decides to throw his or her hat in the ring. We need to simplify our message too. One thing that you notice about how Trump became so popular against the other candidates when he was primarying back in 2016 is that he used small words. He used simple phrases, build the wall, right? So we need to simplify our message to that level as well, make it catchy, make it a stick in your brain. And we need to also clearly counteract false messaging from opponents. If we see something, we need to say something, say it fast and say it even louder than the opponent did. We're not going to let that go challenged and unchallenged anymore. We need to engage directly in the community. That was certainly the reason why Floyd Nicholson was able to pull so many Trump supporters over to his camp. It's the reason why Matthew Miller was able to run or win in his city council election, despite all the money and all the heavy hitting that went against him. He had built a lot of relationships in his ward, and that played to his favor at the end. So we need to be more engaged with churches, civil organizations, local businesses. And at the end of our meeting today, we're going to talk specifically about some things that we're going to do in those areas. We need to provide education on issues. We need to address misinformation wherever possible. For example, the Green New Deal. It's used as a scare phrase by the Republican candidates, but they never tell you why it's scary. They just assume you know it's scary, and they're going to play on that. We can counteract that with education on those issues. We also need to expand our reach. We need to actively seek out youth, Hispanic, LGBTQ input. We were running in 100 different directions this last election and really did not do as good of a job in those areas as we need to do. But the good news is we don't have to wait till an election cycle to do it. We can start doing that tomorrow. And then this is my personal opinion. For candidates that run in 2022, 2024, I say lean into being a progressive Democrat. One thing that I note is that we try to play a balancing act. We try to realize that we are in a red state, but I'm thinking, you know what? Playing the middle of the road may not have worked. I would like to see what happens if somebody went full progressive. It openly embraced the Democratic platform, openly embraced all of the major national issues like the environment, like immigration, etc. And just be loud and proud Democrat, because I got to imagine it can't do any more damage than what we already have seen with the Republican electorate here. So I say let's get that message out and keep hammering away and draw people in. Finally, I think that we also need to keep a good sense of humor. Politics is a very personal topic. It's torn apart families, it's torn apart friendships, it's torn apart business relationships. And for all the work that you put into it, you don't always get the results that you want or hope for. And especially, God bless our candidates for all the efforts they go through. They put their necks out there. So we can only get through this with a good sense of humor. And I think I look at this particular cartoon every day, just seeing Happy Biden down there in that bottom left corner jumping for joy. That just brings me so much pleasure. Anyhow, that's it for my wrap up of election 2020. You have my contact information, and I certainly welcome your input and look forward to future discussions on this topic.